Edmund Burke, Reactionary Prophet. Review of Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. The Atlantic, April 2004. It has always been with me, William Hazlitt wrote, a test of the sense and candour of anyone belonging to the opposite party whether he allowed Burke to be a great man. Not all radicals have been so generous. In a footnote to Volume 1 of Das Kapital, Karl Marx wrote with contempt of Burke. The sycophant, who in the pay of the English oligarchy played the romantic laudator temporis acti against the French Revolution, just as in the pay of the North American colonies at the beginning of the American troubles he had played the liberal against the English oligarchy, was an out-and-out vulgar bourgeois. The old bruiser of the British Museum would not have known that he was echoing a remark by Thomas Jefferson in a letter written to Benjamin Vaughan in May of 1791. The Revolution of France does not astonish me so much as the revolution of Mr. Burke. I wish I could believe the latter proceeded from as pure motives as the former. How mortifying that this evidence of the rottenness of his mind must oblige us now to ascribe to wicked motives those actions of his life which wore the mark of virtue and patriotism. This attribution of mercenariness to Burke, who had in fact accepted a small pension from the British government for services rendered, and who had also been the London lobbyist or representative of the colony of New York during his defence of the rights of the American colonists, is also to be found in the work of Thomas Paine and Dr. Joseph Priestley. It is a frequent vice of radical polemic to assert and even to believe that once you have found the lowest motive for an antagonist, you have identified the correct one. And such reductionism makes a sort of rough partnership with the simplistic view that Burke was the founder or father of modern conservatism in general, and of its English Tory form in particular. In point of fact, Edmund Burke was neither an Englishman nor a Tory. He was an Irishman, probably a Catholic Irishman at that, even if perhaps a secret sympathiser, and for the greater part of his life he upheld the more liberal principles of the Whig faction. He was an advanced opponent of the slave trade, whose sketch of a Negro Code was written in the early 1780s, and who before that had opposed the seating of American slaveholders at Westminster. His epic parliamentary campaign for the impeachment of Warren Hastings and the arraignment of the East India Company was the finest example in its day of a battle against pelf and perks and privilege. His writings on revolution and counter-revolution and on empire are ripe for a Straussian or Machiavellian reading that seeks to discover the arcane or occluded message contained within an ostensibly straightforward text. This is most particularly true of his Reflections on the Revolution in France, which has seldom, if ever, been better analysed and, so to speak, decoded than in this excellent companion edition. One might begin by giving this imperishable book its full name. The original 1790 title page read Reflections on the Revolution in France and on the proceedings in certain societies in London relative to that event, in a letter intended to have been sent to a gentleman in Paris. The gentleman in question was Charles Jean-François Dupont, a young man of Burke's acquaintance who had become a member of the French National Assembly, and had written to him in the fall of 1789. Burke owed him a reply, which turned into a very long letter indeed after its author had been further inspired to put pen to paper. The further inspiration was supplied by two meetings in London of the Constitutional Society and of the Revolution Society, at which were passed warm resolutions welcoming the fall of the Bastille. It was, more than anything else, the alarm he felt at these latter developments that impelled Burke to his response. Please note, then, that Burke chose to stress not the French Revolution, but the revolution in France. He seems to have intended here to speak of the phenomenon of revolution as it applied to French affairs, and as it might be made to apply to English ones, hence the emphatic mention of certain societies in London. The Revolution Society was not as insurgent or incendiary as its name might suggest. It was a rather respectable sodality, dedicated to celebrating the glorious revolution of 1688, a relatively bloodless coup that installed William and Mary of the House of Orange on the English throne and established Protestantism as the state religion. One of the society's leaders was the Reverend Richard Price, a great friend to the American Revolution and a staunch Unitarian clergyman. His resolution, carried by the same meeting that had forwarded a congratulatory address to the National Assembly in Paris, read in part, "This society, sensible of the important advantages arising to this country by its deliverance from popery and arbitrary power." It was made immediately plain to Burke that those who had enthused over revolution across the Channel were also interested in undermining and discrediting the same church that he, an Irishman brought up under anti-Catholic penal laws, felt so obliged to defend. This deep connection has been established by Connor Cruise O'Brien in a masterly series of studies that began with his own edition of the Reflections in 1968. But the point is not a merely sectarian one. In 1780, London had been convulsed and shamed by the hysterical anti-papist Gordon riots, in which a crazed aristocratic demagogue had led a mob against supposedly subversive Catholics. The best evocation of the fury and cruelty of that episode is to be found in Dickens' Barnaby Rudge. This memory was very vivid in Burke's mind, and goes far to explain his visceral detestation of crowd violence. No less to the point, some emulators of Jacobinism, the United Irishmen, with many Protestants among their leaders, were at work in Ireland trying to bring off a rebellion that would compromise all parliamentary moderates, and several of the pro-Jacobin activists and spokesmen in England, not excluding the rather humane Price himself, had had political connections with Lord George Gordon. As between the Jacobite and the Jacobin, Burke could not be neutral for an instant. He might give up the Jacobite cause out of loyalty to the British Crown, but he was profoundly stirred when he saw old-fashioned anti-Catholicism renascent under potentially Republican colours. So one does well to keep Barnaby Rudge in mind, along with A Tale of Two Cities. 3 questions will occur to anybody reconsidering the Reflections today. Was it a grand and prophetic indictment of revolutionary excess? Was it the disdainful shudder of a man who despised or feared what at one stage he described as the swinish multitude? And did it contain what we would now term a hidden agenda? The answer to all 3 questions, it seems to me, is a firm yes. Let us take the 2 most celebrated excerpts of Burke's extraordinary prose. The first is the prescient one. It is known that armies have hitherto yielded a very precarious and uncertain obedience to any senate or popular authority, and they will least of all yield it to an assembly which is only to have a continuance of 2 years. The officers must totally lose the characteristic disposition of military men, if they see with perfect submission and due admiration the dominion of pleaders, especially when they find that they have a new court to pay to an endless succession of those pleaders, whose military policy and the genius of whose command, if they should have any, must be as uncertain as their duration is transient. In the weakness of one kind of authority and in the fluctuation of all, the officers of an army will remain for some time mutinous and full of faction, until some popular general, who understands the art of conciliating the soldiery and who possesses the true spirit of command, shall draw the eyes of all men upon himself. Armies will obey him on his personal account. There is no other way of securing military obedience in this state of things. But the moment in which that event shall happen, the person who really commands the army is your master. The master, that is little, of your king, the master of your assembly, the master of your whole republic. This is almost eerily exact, even in the solitary detail in which it does not body forth the actual coming of Napoleon Bonaparte, who did not emerge until well after the execution of King Louis. It takes care to state that the subordination of existing monarchy would be the least of it. There is only one comparably Cassandra-like prediction that I can call to mind, and that is Rosa Luxemburg's warning to Lenin that revolution can move swiftly from the dictatorship of a class to the dictatorship of a party, to be followed by the dictatorship of a committee of that party, and eventually by the rule of a single man who will soon enough dispense with that committee. Contrast this with Burke's even more famous passage about the fragrance and charisma of Marie Antoinette. It is now 16 or 17 years since I saw the Queen of France, then the Dauphiness, at Versailles, and surely never lighted on this orb, which she hardly seemed to touch, a more delightful vision. I saw her just above the horizon, decorating and cheering the elevated sphere she just began to move in, glittering like the morning star, full of life and splendour and joy. Oh, what a revolution, and what a heart must I have to contemplate without emotion that elevation and that fall. Little did I dream, when she added titles of veneration to those of enthusiastic, distant, respectful love, that she should ever be obliged to carry the sharp antidote against disgrace concealed in that bosom. Little did I dream that I should have lived to see such disasters fallen upon her in a nation of gallant men, in a nation of men of honour and of cavaliers. I thought 10,000 swords must have leapt from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. But the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished for ever. Never, never more shall we behold that generous loyalty to rank and sex, that proud submission, that dignified obedience, that subordination of the heart, which kept alive, even in servitude itself, the spirit of an exalted freedom. The unbought grace of life, the cheap defence of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment and heroic enterprise, is gone. It is gone, that sensibility of principle, that chastity of honour, which felt a stain like a wound, which inspired courage whilst it mitigated ferocity, which ennobled whatever it touched, and under which vice itself lost half its evil by losing all its grossness. One has read this passage very many times. I shall never forget the first time I heard it read aloud by a Tory headmaster, and its meaning and majesty appear to alter with one's mood and evolution. The unbought grace of life is a most arresting phrase, however opaque, just as the cheap defence of nations remains unintelligible. The gallantry and the appeal to chivalry can sometimes seem like the last enchantments of the Middle Age, breathing with an incomparable melancholy and resignation. Alternatively, the entire stave can be held to rank with the most preposterous and empurpled sentimentality ever committed to print, not to be rivalled until the moist, vapid effusions that greeted the death of Diana Spencer, also in Paris, in a banal traffic accident. The latter view, or something very like it, was the one expressed by Burke's friend and confidant, Philip Francis, to whom he had sent the draft and the proofs. The friendship more or less ended when Francis replied, "In my opinion, all that you say of the Queen is pure foppery. If she be a perfect female character, you ought to take your ground upon her virtues. If she be the reverse, it is ridiculous in any but a lover to place her personal charms in opposition to her crimes. Either way, I know the argument must proceed upon a supposition, for neither have you said anything to establish her moral merits, nor have her accusers formally tried and convicted her of guilt." The gash that this inflicted on Burke was not a shallow one. He had admired Philip Francis ever since the latter took an active part in the defence of the rights of India and the consequent impeachment of Warren Hastings. Francis, moreover, was one of the most feared and skilful pamphleteers of the day, writing excoriating letters under the pseudonym Junius, whose identity Burke was one of few to guess. I can't resist pointing out here that Rosa Luxemburg wrote her most famous pamphlet under the same nom de guerre. I do so not just to make a connection that hasn't been observed before, but because Junius is taken from Lucius Junius Brutus, not the Shakespearean regicide, but the hero and founder of the Roman Republic. Not content with taunting Burke about his emotional spasm over Marie Antoinette, Francis urged him, in effect, to give up the whole project, and when it was finally published, in spite of this advice, he wrote Burke a letter in which he coupled the Church with that religion, in short, which was practised or professed, and with great zeal too, by tyrants and villains of every denomination. This English Voltaireanism had the effect of spurring Burke to an even more heated defence of the alliance of religion with order and property. To him, the alleged deism of the revolutionaries was a shabby mask for iconoclastic atheism, nor did he care much for the then fashionable chatter about liberty and rights. As he stated early in the Reflections, "Am I to congratulate a highwayman and murderer who has broke prison upon the recovery of his natural rights? This would be to act over again the scene of the criminals condemned to the galleys and their heroic deliverer, the metaphysic knight of the sorrowful countenance." In other words, Burke was quite ready to anticipate or to meet any charge of quixotism. This did not prevent Thomas Paine from responding that, in the rhapsody of his imagination, he has discovered a world of windmills, and his sorrows are that there are no Quixotes to attack them.
End of Disc 5.